So I'd like to welcome Robert Sikes to the channel today. How are you doing today, mate?
I'm good, man. I appreciate you having me. I'm excited to be chatting with you today.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. But you're known as Keto Savage on the socials, and you have a really long-running podcast and YouTube channel. You're the author of a book called Ketogenic Bodybuilding and a pro-natural bodybuilder. And it's quite a resume. Did I miss anything there, or?
No, it's pretty much the highlight reel for sure, man. Yeah, I've been bodybuilding for, I guess, like 16, 17 years now, and I've been keto for more than half of that. So been keto for quite some time.
Yeah, can you give us a bit of a background regarding your journey from maybe taking a traditional approach to bodybuilding where, carbs were just the standard that we all use, and then when you moved to ketogenic bodybuilding, how did that happen?
Yeah, so I was doing, like I said, traditional bodybuilding, bro diet style for the first several years of my bodybuilding career. I was 115 pounds soaking wet, so I was not big at all genetically. And I bulked up to 230 pounds. And I gave myself 12 weeks to compete in my first show because that's what all the magazines suggested. Like you go to the grocery store, you pick up a magazine, it's like 12-week cut. So I did that, and I lost 80 pounds in 12 weeks. And did it very unhealthy, lost a ton of muscle in the process, developed a bunch of eating disorders, and knew there had to be a better way, but didn't know what that way was. And that pretty much was my protocol for the first 2 or 3 competitions I did, or 3 or 4 competitions I did. And in 2014, 2015, after my third competition, I started dabbling in carbohydrate backloading developed by John Kiefer. And that's basically keto during the day and then carbs at night, high glycemic index carbs at night. And I noticed that I just felt better without the carbs. So I started doing carb backloading without carbs, which lo and behold is pretty much keto. And this was before, there was any books on keto or podcasts or anything of that nature. So I just rolled up my sleeves and figured out kind of how to make it work on the fly. And I felt great. I kind of developed, a better relationship with food. I got leaner than I'd ever gotten. I didn't really see any performance, hindrance in the gym. And I just decided to run with it and compete with that ketogenic approach. And that's when I got my first pro card through one federation, and then I competed again in 2023 this past season and got my pro card in the WNBF Federation, all with a strict ketogenic diet.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned John Kiefer there, because I remember using his carb backloading in the early 2000s, I think it was as well. And
Yeah.
I think I probably preceded you because I've been training for like over 30 years. And my 90s influences in terms of ketogenic approaches was, remember, Dan Duchesne's Body Opus. You had Lyle McDonald. There was even Dr. Warren Wiley. He had a book called That Was Better Than Steroids, and he advocated a keto approach. Then you had Keto Built by Josh Bryant. But did you have any kind of other influences as well that influenced you, or is this something that you just found out on the way?
Yeah, I mean, I was following, bodybuilding.com, and I was watching, Lane Norton do natural bodybuilding. So I definitely knew I wanted to go the natural route. But as far as natural bodybuilding goes, the dietary protocol that's pretty much widely used is either the bro diet or flexible dieting. So, if it fits your macros. And I did that for quite some time, but it just did not seem optimal to me. Like with the carb backloading, like I didn't experience any fat gain with those high glycemic index carbs. And having gone through John Kiefer's protocol as well, like he advocates high glycemic index carbs, so like really sugary food. So I would just slam a bunch of ice cream and stuff at the end of the day. And I got to thinking, like, this probably isn't the most optimal approach for long-term health and nutrition. So I started just focusing on keto. And, if you do a well-formulated ketogenic diet, especially when I started before there was all these products, it's like you're eating real quality animal-based nutrition. And when you do that, you just take the guesswork out of it. You don't feel guilty with the foods you're consuming, and it's much easier to adhere to without any of the recourse. So it just seemed like a natural fit for me.
Yeah, when you say that it's a natural fit, I think a lot of us go through that same sort of process because, we're told that we need carbs when we're bodybuilding and we all gravitate to the traditional approaches. But there's this little intuitive voice that always tells us at the back of our minds, this doesn't quite feel right. Like when we switch to a zero carb or a ketogenic approach, we notice that we're feeling better, we perform better. But, sometimes ignore it and shut it out. But what are some of the short-term or the long-term benefits that you noticed going from that traditional carb-based approach to eliminating carbs?
Well, short term, I definitely noticed a reduction in overall inflammation. Like my knees didn't hurt anymore, my joints didn't hurt anymore. So I was able to train more frequently without as much of a recovery time in between training sessions. So that was a big benefit. Less GI distress, less bloat, more mental acuity, less brain fog, like all the things that people talk about. But for me, like the big hindrance was just the relationship with food that I was, dealing with. So when I switched over to keto, I don't know if it was hormonal or like psychological or physiological or probably some combination of all the above, but my relationship with food just significantly improved. And that alone was reason enough for me to stick with it, even if I had not experienced the benefits from a performance standpoint. But lo and behold, those came as well. So for me, it was a pretty easy transition because it was better than anything I'd done before.
Yeah, interesting. I've had much the same journey. And I've also found that when I try to reintroduce carbs beyond, say, like a 1 day refeed, I get a backlash, which is so much more severe than if I just kept the carbs in. So if I've been ketogenic or carnivore for a long time, and then I might have a few days of carbs, I find that it wildly throws me off, and my symptoms come flying back in terms of the aches and pains, the brain fog, everything else. Do you notice much the same thing?
Well, I haven't had a carb day in 8, 9 years, so I can't really speak from experience, but I have had a lot
Wow.
of clients that have done that. And it definitely seems to be a situation in which if you're either, I mean, you could either optimize from a ketogenic fat metabolism standpoint or from a carbohydrate and glucose metabolism standpoint. I think where people go awry is when they try to do like this dual fuel protocol and they try and do both. And I think when they do that, they wind up staying in nutritional purgatory, limbo land, so to speak, and they never really reach their full potential.
That's a really good way of putting it, and it's a balance that I've been trying to fight with over the past couple of years, especially with carnivore, because I sort of thought, we listen to all these influencers and voices in the space that say we definitely need carbs to optimize our bodybuilding. So I'm always trying to walk this fine line of, okay, maybe there's a sweet spot of carbs that I can have, every day or post workout or pre workout or intra workout, or maybe once a week as a refeed that's going to give me those optimal results. But it's interesting to hear you say that, without having any carbs for 7 years, you've been really able to maximize the process. Because I've also found that the longer I stay on carnivore or keto, the better it works in
Yeah,
terms of my health and even my performance. But
that's a
sometimes I
big
always
thing.
sort of think, yes, go on.
That's a big thing right there. I feel like so many people, they short circuit their potential, but like what I've found is that the longer you adhere to it strictly, the better you get. Like the more adapted your body becomes, the more metabolic pathways are upregulated, the more efficient you're able to perform and recover. My argument is that if you stick with it indefinitely, you just keep getting better. So that's kind of why I've taken this strict ketogenic approach and not really had those carb days.
Yeah, why specifically ketogenic and not carnivore? Can you explain your reasoning for the difference in the approaches and why you're not totally, like, say, carnivore? It seems to be the trend these days.
Yeah, it's definitely a trend. I mean, in all honesty, I consider carnivore a simple subset of keto. It's just a more exclusionary version of a ketogenic diet. Because when you're carnivore, I mean, you're leveraging fat metabolism. Unless your protein is, in crazy excess to your fats, then you're still using fat metabolism as your primary fuel substrate. And if you're not, and you're doing a carnivore, then you're inefficiently using protein as the primary substrate, which is just not great, anyways. But generally speaking, carnivore is just a subset of keto. And for me, I don't have any of these crazy intolerances that a lot of people do have, which is why they gravitate towards carnivore to begin with. But honestly, like I don't really eat a lot of vegetation anyways. Like I'm pretty much as close to carnivore as you can get without being officially carnivore. I'm eating predominantly animal-based proteins and fats and then a keto brick every day. So that's pretty much my only deviation. I'll occasionally have a salad or some, fermented foods, but honestly, my vegetation intake is pretty minimal.
Are you on the same wavelength or the mindset that vegetables are on a spectrum of toxicity, and that, a lot of they sort of say that vegetables are trying to kill us and they don't want to be eaten? Do you reconcile that as well with your own thinking?
I think there are certainly instances where that is the case, but as a general rule of thumb, I don't think that all vegetables are trying to kill us by any means. I see where they're coming from, and that logic does make intuitive sense in a lot of ways. But I'm kind of like a homesteader, back to the roots, basics. Like if I'm growing my own food, I'm not using chemicals on it, and it's like a tomato or something like that. Yeah, there's gonna be some natural sugars in that tomato, but I can tolerate that tomato. It makes a caprese salad very delicious, and I don't have any issues from it. So occasionally I'll throw that in and not feel guilty. But a lot of people get so, dogmatic towards their approach that they just don't even allow themselves some simple pleasures. And yeah, I don't think that tomato is going to be offering me any inherent performance benefits necessarily, but if I enjoy it and it doesn't cause any detriment either, I might as well include it.
Yeah, along the same theme, are there any instances why you might recommend a carnivore approach over a keto approach?
Yeah, I mean, some people are most definitely more sensitive to these different forms of vegetation, and their body does not respond well to them. So in that case, 100%, yeah, just avoid them entirely and don't worry about it. Like, I'm definitely not in the camp of you have to have a certain, daily intake of fiber to function at a high rate. I mean, I don't consume hardly any fiber, and I've not had any issues from a GI standpoint ever. So I don't think they're offering any inherent benefit or requirement that we have to include. So if somebody prefers and responds better to a carnivore approach in the complete absence of that dietary vegetation, then I'm all for it.
One of the comprehensive aspects that I've noticed about your approach is that you get a lot of blood work done. How does that look in terms of being on keto for so long? Is your LDL levels quite elevated? Is there any alarm over those figures
I
at
mean,
all?
they're not like incredibly elevated. They are elevated based off of Western medicine standards. I think last time I checked my LDL, it was over 200, I think, but it wasn't much beyond that. And when my HDL is also very high, and my trigs are super low. I think my trigs are like 36. So when you look at the average, cholesterol ratio, my ratio is all within the quote unquote green lines that they want it to be in. So yeah, my cholesterol levels are all totally fine. I haven't gotten a CAC scan. I probably should, but I'm not really worried about it either. Like, I don't feel like I'm at risk of any, atherosclerosis or anything like that. I don't feel like I have any calcification in my arteries. Probably should get that test done, but my LDL has not been high enough to warrant me any concern by any means.
One of the blood markers that I noticed fluctuated quite, say, maybe trending negative would be the SHBG, the IGF-1 and growth hormone. Have you found that on the keto approach as well, or would I be just the exemption to that rule? Or
I mean, I think a lot of that is genetic as well. Like, my SHGB has always been a little higher. Not sure why. I think some of that, like I said, may be genetic, because I'm not really doing any of the things that would cause that to be higher. Like, I've gone through all of my household goods, like the cleaning products we use, the clothes we wear, like all the things that people say to look out for from like a phytoestrogen, xenoestrogen standpoint. Like, I'm avoiding all those things. So I don't feel like I've got any environmental toxins coming in. So I think in my case, my slightly elevated sex hormone binding globulin is just a result of some genetic predisposition to that. But I mean, if your total testosterone and free testosterone are still within a healthy range, then if you have slightly elevated sex hormone binding globulin, it's not the end of the world either.
yeah, how about your growth hormone and IGF-1? Are they still within range, or are they quite suppressed
Yeah,
being on this kind of approach? Or
all of those have been solid. Like, when I do a crazy, prep, like I did this last time, my total testosterone tanked for sure. But that was just very short lived when I was that lean. I think my total testosterone at the depth of my prep was 86, which is like pretty freaking low.
yeah.
Wouldn't recommend that for anybody. But again, that was because I was so lean. Like, I was, I think, 3.9% body fat at my leanest. And sex hormones are so tightly linked to body fat levels. And when you're sub 5% body fat as a male, everything just starts shutting down. That's why I'm such an advocate for reverse dieting and coming back up to a healthy body fat, taking in a healthy amount of food, because you can't healthfully sustain that level of conditioning for any significant length of time.
I know a lot of guys will deliberately crush their estrogen using, performance enhancement drugs around, the final weeks of competitive dieting. How's your estrogen levels in those final weeks?
I feel like my estrogen levels all stayed pretty well within range. Like, I didn't really see a massive flux in that. Total testosterone was the only one that really changed much. But yeah, like, all of my other markers from a hormonal standpoint seem to be relatively stable. And I think a lot of the benefit of a ketogenic approach is that you are still consuming ample dietary fat throughout the entirety of the prep. Like, once you reach a level of body composition and leanness, you're going to see a tank in hormone levels for the most part. But by simply keeping dietary fat relatively high, you can mitigate a lot of that. Like, these traditional prep diets that involve, keeping total dietary fat at 20 or 30 grams a day, in the context of incredibly low calories, like, that's just a recipe for disaster from a hormonal standpoint.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I'm just also wondering, like, just from the carnivore perspective as well, and I promise we'll move on to other topics.
No, you're
what
good.
what are carnivores missing that maybe a keto somebody on a keto approach, just in terms of foods, what are carnivores missing that somebody on a keto approach couldn't or wouldn't go without?
I mean, I don't necessarily think there's anything that they're missing inherently, but with carnivore, like, if someone has the, sensitivities to certain forms of vegetation and they need to take a super exclusive style diet, then they can totally make carnivore work for them. But if they don't have any of those sensitivities, I think they would actually benefit from having more nutrient variety and just, a greater option of foods. For instance, like because I'm not hardcore strict carnivore, I'll allow myself, cacao butter, olive oil. I'll allow myself certain dairies, and depending on how strict you want to go with carnivore, like sometimes they don't allow dairies. Certain seasonings, which I just enjoy, it makes my food flavor better. So like if you don't mind having those things, there's no adverse effect. You might as well include them. Like cacao butter, using that as an example, like that is the world's highest, richest source of stearic acid. Beef tallow is also a great source, but a lot of people don't have a lot of beef tallow, or they don't incorporate that to their carnivore approach. So if they're not, or beef suet rather. So if they're not incorporating that, then they're missing out from that stearic acid standpoint. And honestly, I think a lot of people that are doing carnivore, it's oftentimes easier for them to overdo the protein relative to the dietary fat, especially if they're doing leaner cuts of food like chicken or poultry or fish, for instance. And when you're trying to optimize your performance from a fat metabolism standpoint, if you're taking in too much dietary protein relative to dietary fat, you're just simply not going to optimize those metabolic pathways. Like when I do a really high protein version of carnivore, I can start to notice some additional pain and inflammation in my joints that I'm not experiencing when my fat ratio is in a more tolerable level.
Do you think that's because of more pronounced gluconeogenesis?
Yeah, I think it's probably a myriad of effects. I think, there is definitely the gluconeogenic effect. Maybe just the abundance, the surplus of amino acids in circulation. I'm not sure there's any one thing that you can pinpoint it to. I just know it to be true. Like if I have calories equated for, I can do this experiment isocalorically. And if I have like a ton of chicken versus, like a 80-20 beef, like my joints hurt more the next day, like without question. So yeah, I mean, there's no additional carbohydrates or sugars coming in from the diet. That's just simply a change in protein ratios.
100%. Recently, I tried, because just simply due to the cost of food and beef especially, I tried adding in the majority of my food intake from, say, fish or, chicken thighs especially. But I found it just didn't work. It was just horrible, like the effect of it compared to regular beef predominant carnivore. So, yeah.
Did your joints hurt more, like more pain?
Everything from really bad brain fog to joint pain to I just didn't feel as good as I did when I was, when you wake up on carnivore, you feel fantastic. You just feel that very even keeled mind all day long. Yeah, I just didn't feel like that at all on chicken and fish.
I mean, I'm a huge advocate for protein. Like protein is incredibly important, and there's certainly a movement for prioritizing protein right now, which I'm all in favor of. But it's oftentimes come at the expense of not ample dietary fat or too much protein. And these big advocates for protein are oftentimes, saying and suggesting that there's no adverse effect whatsoever, and there's no cap to the amount of protein you can consume. But anybody that's been doing this for a length of time, like yourself, you start having a lot of protein relative to fat and you don't feel as good. Like there's a reason for that,
Yeah, fully agree. One of the criticisms leveled at the carnivore or the keto approach is the difficulty in adding weight in the off season, particularly when people are trying to bulk. Because we know that protein and fats are inherently satiating, and we've probably both noticed that you can eat less calories, when you include a lot of carbs and you'll add weight. But the effect of having more calories on keto or a carnivore approach, maybe you don't add weight. So sometimes that calories in versus calorie out approach doesn't quite kind of balance out when you compare the two. I know that even Stan Efferding, who, is quite in favor sometimes of keto or carnivore approaches, he's even said, but when you're trying to add weight, it's like trying to take the stairs versus the elevator. And even Lyle McDonald, he sort of, when I put the same question to him about using a keto or a carnivore approach for bulking, he sort of said, why would you? It would just make the job so much more difficult. So what's your thoughts on adding muscle using a carnivore diet in the off season?
I mean, I don't seem to have any issue adding lean tissue in the complete absence of carbohydrates. Again, this is just me, but I've noticed the same thing in my clients. I think when it comes to adding lean tissue, you've got to pretty much check 4 primary boxes. You got to get ample recovery, so ample sleep. You got to make sure you're consuming enough total calories so that you're in an energy surplus, ideally. Consume ample protein, and then elicit enough of a training stimulus to subject your body to give it reason to grow. Like if you check those 4 boxes, you'll build muscle. And carbohydrates is not included in that list of check boxes. So you don't have to have the carbohydrates. And I mean, honestly, I'm, 40 pounds up pretty much from my competition weight this past competitive season. I haven't had any carbohydrates in that time frame. All of my lifts are up. My lean tissue is up significantly. And that's all been in a complete absence of carbohydrates. So the notion that you have to have carbs to build more muscle just seems very obscure to me. And as far as like whether or not that's optimal for building muscle, you may be able to gain a slight increase in lean tissue with carbohydrates, but you also put on additional body fat that you can oftentimes bypass, unnecessary body fat that you can oftentimes bypass by not having those carbohydrates. So at the end of the day, I'm not convinced that you would put on more muscle, but even if you were to, and you had additional body fat that came with it, you would have to diet down harder to remove that additional body fat. So at the end of the day, the net outcome is a wash. Like I don't feel like I'm missing out from a lean mass standpoint by not having the carbohydrates.
Yeah, I think what dissuades a lot of people from trying to actually add muscle during the off season using a keto or a carnivore approach is that they feel very flat whilst doing so. They just don't have that fullness that sometimes the carbs can do by drawing water into the muscle. How do you deal mentally, say, like, or do you even feel flat when you're in the off season, or are you quite full because you're using a lot more fats?
Yeah, I feel like once my fat ratio, my protein ratio is dialed in, like once my macronutrient distribution is dialed in and my electrolytes are on point, then I have no issues whatsoever getting a pump and having muscle fullness. I feel like a lot of people do certainly feel flat in the absence of carbohydrates because they are oftentimes just simply not deeply fat adapted. Once you're deeply fat adapted, it takes longer than a month, then your body's ability to replenish muscle glycogen is pretty much on par of that with someone that is consuming carbohydrates, and your body's ability to preserve muscle glycogen is improved. So if you've got ample muscle glycogen stores and your electrolytes are down and your muscles are hydrated, then there's no reason why you wouldn't have the same quality pump that you would in the inclusion of carbohydrates.
Can you talk a little bit about dialing in your electrolytes with a little bit more nuance and just a little bit more explanation on the topic, because a lot of people maybe misunderstand what they need to do with their electrolytes. They take a packet of LMNT and think that's got it covered. But I've also found recently that I started a very physically intensive job where I'm working 7 or 8 hours a day, lifting heavy, and it's just like an all-day workout basically. And in the hot sun, it can be quite harsh on my body as well. And I found that I started getting creeping brain fog back in as well. And I noticed that I had to heavily increase my salt intake, and then everything went away. So it's amazing how you can just, through electrolyte manipulation, improve some of these, things that you're doing with this diet. Can you speak to that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, it's super important. Like our entire body, physiologically speaking, is electrical. Like our brain synapses, our muscle contractions and muscle fiber twitching, like it's all electrical. So that has to be dialed in. And you have to make sure you've got enough hydration throughout your entire body for that conductivity to take place. So generally speaking, about a 2-to-1 ratio of supplemental sodium to potassium seems to work pretty well. So I'll typically target, 4,000 milligrams sodium to 2,000 milligrams potassium for people to start. And then I'll scale up from there based off of how their body's responding and how they're feeling. What I've noticed is that as I get leaner and leaner and my calories get lower and lower, my craving and just bodily demand for electrolytes increases. So at the end of my prep, I was taking in 15,000 milligrams of sodium, which is quite a bit, but my body responded very well to it. And once you've got the ratio dialed in, it's not like you're holding on to a bunch of additional unnecessary, fluid retention as a result of that increased sodium intake. Once your electrolytes and your fluid hydration levels are in check, your body's able to regulate that pretty effectively. And then you're able to just simply stay hydrated, stay at the proper ratio, and then your body performs accordingly. But yeah, a lot of people just simply aren't taking in enough of that electrolyte supplementation.
How do you respond to clients or people say that when they do a keto approach, they have a drop in performance in the gym or they lose strength? I always get this feedback very often when I do a carnivore-based vid. But what about if the drop in performance also doesn't seem to improve over time? How would you help someone with this?
I mean, oftentimes when I get that criticism, it's because they just haven't given it the time that it needs. So you're producing ketones within 24 hours of removing the carbohydrates. So you can technically be in ketosis, within a day or two from the absence of carbohydrates. But that doesn't mean the metabolic pathways that are used to shuttle the ketones effectively into the cells and use as a substrate for fuel both in the muscles and the brain are dialed or upregulated. Certainly doesn't mean that your body's efficiently using fat metabolism to its utmost potential. And that takes months and months and months. Oftentimes I tell people, give it a minimum of 6 months of strict adherence to the diet, and then let me know what your performance is like relative to what it was prior. But I think if you're not giving it at least 6 months, you're giving yourself a disservice.
Yeah, absolutely. Other critics of the approach might say that if the keto approach or the carnivore approach was optimal, then the top guys and girls would be using it. And I know you're a professional in yourself, but most elite caliber athletes might go low carb for a stretch, or they use keto as a tool in the toolbox, but they're never rarely or exclusively keto. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, in the federation, like if the IFBB is what we're talking about, they're all taking drugs anyways, much of which is, insulin, kind of like we were talking about earlier. And if they're using insulin, then taking a ketogenic approach is not going to be very effective for them. Kind of defeats the purpose there. But from a natural standpoint, I feel like there's just so much dogma ingrained into the thinking that they've been using carbohydrates for so long. That's all they know what to do. And you are starting to see a lot more people branch into a ketogenic approach. And I'm hoping to kind of move the needle that direction and just showcase to people what is possible, because I certainly think it's optimal. I certainly think it's healthier. So I think if we get more people to go down that route, they would see success with it. Now, whether or not the people that are taking drugs go that route, I'm not sure what's going to happen. I mean, that is certainly where the money and the eyes and the attention are within the sport of bodybuilding, because people want to pay to see the freaks. And again, I don't know what their performance markers would be like in the context of a ketogenic diet with all those drugs. I don't see any reason as to why they wouldn't be just as effective. Obviously, they would not use the insulin, but they're using a myriad of other drugs. So, I mean, they can certainly go about their protocol, their stack without the insulin, and probably see still quite impressive results.
And it's quite funny when these same critics say that the top guys and girls never use keto or low carb approaches. If you look back to the 70s, a lot of their diets were aligned very along the same parameters as low carb, almost
Oh,
carnivore or keto as well.
yeah.
So when drugs weren't such the factor, then the top people were definitely using a similar approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's so much gets lost in translation when you look at, what people are doing now. I wouldn't want to do what a lot of top people are doing now, because I feel like that's a massive detriment to my health. I want to do what's healthiest, in the big picture of things.
Yeah, that's a great point and a great message as well. Just for those people that are more in general pop, you hear a lot of the talking heads in the nutrition space say that no one diet is better than another. So calories all being the same, they all equate to the same result at the end of the day. But what have you noticed in regards to using keto, with that statement?
Yeah, I feel like, I get what they're saying. Like when you do, equate calories, you can most definitely lean out with an approach that is not keto. You could lean out eating nothing but processed foods. And if you are leaner, and especially when you're comparing this to a sample size of, traditional population nowadays, which is morbidly obese and incredibly unhealthy, then yeah, just simply getting leaner is going to massively improve all your health markers. But I would argue that long term, over one's lifetime, taking a diet that's full in processed foods and carbohydrates and sugars, it's going to be more taxing to the liver. That's going to cause more glycation at the cellular level. Like that just to me does not seem like the optimal way to go about it. Whereas if you are returning to what we are designed to eat as a species, which is a diet with ample fats and proteins from animal-based sources, like our body's machinery has evolved over who knows how long to operate well with that input. So it just makes sense to me that we would perform better from a longevity standpoint with that consistent input.
100%. And it just baffles me these days when I see at the gym, as soon as guys have finished their workout, they pull out a box of cereal and then they
Yeah.
start eating like a sugary cereal at the gym as like the new anabolic window post-workout carb source. And I shake my head at that. I sort of think that's not leading to a good place at the end of the day. You try doing that for 20 years and see where you're at.
Oh, I used to do the same thing, man. Like I used to have what was my go-to? I had Pixie Sticks and Sour Patch Kids post-workout, and that was gonna I slammed that post-workout. And I feel like if I didn't have that plus my protein shake, I would have missed my window of opportunity for anabolic signaling, and all my gains would be for naught. And now, hindsight, looking back at it, I just laugh because it's like that's so far from the truth. Plus, it's not enjoyable or sustainable. I don't want to do that. I would rather just eat like we were designed to eat as a human. And I mean, shoot, man, a big old steak is by far more tasty than a pack of Skittles.
We've been definitely sold some bullshit over the years that has led us down some dead end paths, I tell you. Have you
Absolutely.
ever have you ever found some cases where a small segment of your client population where keto just doesn't work for? And what are the signs that a diet might not fit their psychology or their physiology?
So there are some people that have familial hypercholesterolemia. So like if they have this predisposed genetic, criteria that would allow them to not operate well with high dietary fat, that would be an issue. That'd be a point there. But honestly, that is certainly not the majority. There are people that have hormonal issues. A lot of women, they'll have irregular cycles, and they will notice a benefit in their cycle regulating from the inclusion of carbohydrates. However, that is oftentimes in the context of them being chronically under, fed for far too long. So if you take that same female client and then just simply give them ample calories for a long enough period of time for their hormones to stabilize, they'll oftentimes see their cycle regulate without the need for carbohydrates. So I think, there are not really any instances in which it straight up would not work for them from a physical standpoint. Now, from a psychological standpoint, that's where we as a species get a little tricky because, unlike any other species out there that just simply knows inherently what it's supposed to eat and what it's not supposed to eat, us humans can never figure that out, it seems. And a lot of people have these, social settings. They have, emotional attachments to food. They may not be willing to forego certain sweets and carbohydrate-based foods because of whatever reason. So when you bring in the psychological component, there may be an argument for keto, quote unquote, not working for them because they find it unsustainable. But from a strictly physiological standpoint, there's not really any reason why it wouldn't work for them.
One of the things that I've trended away from over the years is, especially since going carnivore, is the use of any supplements. I just haven't found the need for them. And I find that people shotgun a whole bunch of supplements a lot of the time, not really knowing what they do or what their interaction with one another are. Are there any supplements that you use today yourself or with clients that you find necessary to include as doing a keto approach?
Man, I'm in the same boat as you. I'm super minimal with my supplements. I've never really used a lot of supplements, but I've definitely had periods in my life where I would like go to GNC and just spend hours looking at all the ingredient lists and try to get every edge that I could. And with natural bodybuilding especially, there's so many banned substances. They're not just steroids. I mean, obviously steroids are banned, but a lot of the pre-workouts are banned. They have all these ingredients that they frown upon. And I just get anxiety trying to figure out if what I've taken at some point in my life would have banned me from a competition. So now it's like, okay, screw it. I'm just taking nothing except what I know to be incredibly clean, and I'm fine with that. I mean, so now my supplementation is pretty much as minimal as you can get. Like I'll take a creatine monohydrate, I'll take electrolytes, and that's pretty much it, man. Some vitamin D on occasion. Like I've got a friend that makes a clean non-stem pre-workout. I'll use that. But that's pretty much it. Like maybe I'll start a supplement company someday, in which case I know exactly what's in it and I can get more, granulars to figuring out what would lead to some incremental gains. But honestly, if your diet's dialed in, you don't really need that much supplementation.
Yeah, in saying that, do you ever take any, say, liver supplements or raw organ supplements? Not to mention the Liver King exclusively, but do you find that including organ meats actually kind of helps the keto diet at all, or do you not like the taste of them?
I like the taste of organ meats. I like the taste, I like the texture. So I'll include organ meats, and I'll preferentially use actual organ meats as opposed to like a desiccated supplement form of it. But yeah, I mean, I've got like I hunt as well. So anytime I'm hunting, I'll have venison in the freezer, and I keep the liver, I keep the heart, I keep a lot of the organ meats, and I'll use that throughout the year. So yeah, I'm all for it for sure. I'm a big advocate of eating the entire animal.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, not too many people do that. That's something to be proud of. But you've also formulated something called a keto brick. Can you explain to people that are not familiar with what that is?
Yeah, so keto brick is I made that kind of out of my own need and desire for something that was shelf stable, hit my macros accurately, and just took the guesswork out of meal prep. And I developed that for my own personal use back in my 2017 competition prep, and never planned on it being a product. But lo and behold, there was a lot of interest around it. I was documenting my prep on YouTube. People kept asking about it. So I decided to just roll up my sleeves and make it a product alongside my wife. And we've done just that. It's basically a 1,000 calorie ketogenic shelf stable meal replacement bar. And saying all that on the heels of talking about the importance of just eating real food, not supplementing, totally get how somebody listening to this would think I'm being hypocritical. I always advocate for people to prioritize, getting their food, their nutrition from single source, quality, wholesome, animal foods. But in instances where you are going to be traveling or you want a streamlined option, having something like the keto brick makes things easier. It takes the guesswork out of it. I eat one every single day. I pretty much eat it after I train, and then I'll have my high calorie animal based meal with lots of fats and proteins in the evening. But yeah, the brick is predominantly made from cacao butter, kind of like I was talking about earlier, being the highest source of stearic acid. So I basically get that quality fat in via the brick, and then the other nutrition I had throughout the day, that pretty much always nails my macros perfectly.
How do you think? What do you think about intermittent fasting recently? This whole body of, well, not I suppose a whole body, but there was some research that came out recently that said that intermittent fasting basically causes heart disease. I think it's ridiculous, but how do you find, or how do you fit fasting into your approach? Do you, especially when you're contest dieting, do you do longer fasts or do you do intermittent fasting? And what are some of the benefits of doing so?
I have not seen that still. I have to check that out. But as far as intermittent fasting, I'm kind of doing that every day just by default. So I typically eat 2 meals a day. And then as my calories get lower, I'll transition to an OMAD approach. So just 1 meal a day, because I find it more satiating and more enjoyable to have one large meal that actually satisfies me than have multiple smaller meals that always leave me wanting more. So as my calories get lower, I'll have that 1 meal a day approach. So pretty much a 23-hour fast in essence. So yeah, totally a fan of that. As far as extended fasting goes, I don't really ever recommend that in the context of being in a caloric deficit, because it's just too many stressors on the body. But if I'm in a pretty significant caloric surplus, I'll throw in an extended fast, intermittently every quarter or so, to just kind of give my body a breather from, trying to upregulate the nutrition and just, assimilate the nutrition from that aggressive surplus.
What are some of your tricks in suppressing appetite doing the 1 meal a day or even the 2 meals a day? Because I find, especially like people like myself who have really high, appetites, it's just so hard to condense it down to 1 or 2 meals a day.
Uh, have a business with a bunch of stressors. That'll keep your mind preoccupied for a while. But that, I mean, honestly, having like coffee kind of acts as an appetite suppressant as well. Having, I don't really recommend a bunch of filler foods in that context, which is very counterintuitive to what people conventionally do in prep diets. Is they'll have a lot of fiber, a lot of vegetation, a lot of low calorie bulk foods, but that actually hinders the absorption of the foods that you are trying to consume and absorb. So I don't really recommend that. So honestly, just simply having that one large meal that sends a signal to my body and brain that, okay, you're full, and then not thinking about food throughout the rest of the day. Like once you start thinking about food, that anticipatory signal starts happening, and then you start craving things and getting hungrier. But if you can just have that one meal, be satisfied, and know that you're not going to eat again for another 24 hours, that's an easier thing for your body to wrap its mind around. And I find that in and of itself is pretty beneficial.
That's a really interesting, and it's a great tips that you provided there, because a lot of the influences that I mentioned before in regards to ketogenic diet, they sort of say just eat unlimited amounts of, like you said, plant material, like vegetables and whatnot, snacking on that throughout the day, because they're not going to really upset the balance too much. But you gave some great reasons as to why it probably doesn't work optimally. On the other hand, with refeeds, a lot of those same influences will also suggest a carb refeed once per week. You're obviously not in favor of it, but you're still in favor of refeeds. What's your approach?
Yeah, so when I'm dieting down for a prep, I'll throw in a ketogenic caloric refeed, so a bolus of fat and protein. And I'll normally start that, 4 to 6 weeks out from my show. And I kind of use it as a way to run a few trial peak weeks to see how my body responds to that bolus in calories, along with some minor electrolyte manipulation to see how it would peak in the actual peak week. So I'll do that. But yeah, it's just a bolus of fat and protein. Usually I'll start with about a 30% increase above baseline and then scale up from there. But yeah, definitely no need for the carb refeed.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you find that every prep is more the same, or is every prep different for you? Like, do you kind of like you lay out the formula and it basically happens as you lay it out, or you need to tweak each one because each prep is completely different?
Well, I've got more muscle on my frame each time I prep, so I would look different at a given set of calories one year versus the next. So I can't really just follow a standardized, okay, this is what my calories are, this is what my macros are 16 weeks out from a show, and it'd be perfect. So I really just have to listen to my body and then adjust based off of the feedback I'm getting from that. But as far as the actual protocol goes, if I adhere to that, then I'm pretty well solid.
You carry an impressive amount of muscle on your frame, and your pictures and the way that you document your journey on your Instagram is excellent, because you lay everything out to the T, so people can really follow in detail your approach and how it works, along with the photos, which are very standard. There's no kind of like trick photography or filters that you're applying. You look fantastic as a natural. But in your research and experience, is there an ideal training style methodology that seems to fit best with a keto bodybuilding diet? Do you take a high volume, heavy lifting, certain splits, etc., or what's your thoughts on training?
I don't think you need to have like a specific training protocol that would be different for keto versus something else. I don't think there's going to be benefit to doing like a 2-a-day approach, because you want to make sure your body has ample time to replenish any muscle glycogen that is burned throughout the training session, especially in the context of a deficit. But if you're, giving your body 24 hours between training sessions, then you should be fine either way. And I've done lots of different training variations. Like I've done, traditional body part splits, which is what I've done the majority of my lifting career. But for the past year and a half, probably coming up on 2 years now, I've been doing a full body split, which I've responded well to. And I think it's because I've just had increased training frequency for a given body part. So rather than having like a, leg day, chest day, back day, and then not hitting that same muscle group for another, 6 days or so, 7 days, with the full body, I'm training every single body part every single day, 5 days a week. So I'm getting much, much more training frequency. And I think that's beneficial as a natural bodybuilder. I'm not hitting that single muscle with as much intensity as if I was to have one day dedicated to it specifically. But by having that much frequency, it's getting about the same amount of volume throughout the course of a week, which I think is beneficial for it from a recovery standpoint, and also just from a enjoyment standpoint. Like I enjoy having a little more variety in my training session that way.
So you do the full body approach because you're pretty happy with the balance of your development, or is there some body parts that you think still need to come up a little bit more?
Yeah, for me personally, my lagging body part is my chest. Pretty much my chest. Like my legs used to be my lagging body part, and I can certainly add more tissue, especially my hamstrings. So like everything always needs to get better, in my opinion. But my chest is definitely my lagging body part now. So focusing on that more would be key.
Yeah. Your book, Ketogenic Bodybuilding, is I think one of the best, because it lays out this blueprint for people that were wanting to peak their physique for a contest or an event. A lot of the other books on ketogenic bodybuilding, they're very generic. They're just they're kind of wishy-washy in a lot of the information that they give out, but yours breaks it down to the nth degree that somebody could follow, and I think that they could definitely get the best results from following your plan in that book. But can you give us some kind of brief overview into the 7 phases outlined in your book? You don't have to go into any kind of depth, but it's just interesting, that 7 phases that you've outlined.
Yeah, so I appreciate that, first of all. From a high level, the 7 phases are as such. So phase 1 is pretty much establishing your baseline, figuring out what your composition is, what your maintenance calories are, starting with a macro distribution, which is generally a higher fat ratio at the onset, and pretty much just getting that initial baseline established. Phase 2 is increasing dietary protein while dietary fat is simultaneously dropping. Since we start with the high fat ratio, you have very little protein at the onset, but we're going to be increasing that week after week until we find the individual's unique protein threshold, which is going to be different for everybody. Phase 3 is dropping both fat and protein. So both macronutrients are declining, all the while overall calories are dropping. Phase 4 is the introduction of ketogenic caloric refeeds, kind of like we talked about earlier. At that point, calories are pretty low. They would benefit psychologically from having a higher day to look forward to. Plus, there's a metabolic benefit from having that one high day as well in the context of lower calories. Phase 5 is pretty much the peaking phase. So whether you're stepping on stage or you have a photo shoot or whatever the case may be, that's pretty much when you would technically peak. And then that acts as a line in the sand of like, okay, this is where the cut is over. Then you can transition into phase 6, which is the start of the reverse diet, which also involves the inclusion of ketogenic caloric refeeds. And those are going to be decreasing as the daily intake is increasing until they more or less meet in the middle. And at that point, you can phase out those refeeds and move on to phase 7, which is basically the reestablishment of what your new maintenance intake is, and then transitioning into a slight surplus so that you can build more muscle before your next competitive season or fat loss phase.
It really is a brilliant book, and I recommend that all people go and check it out, especially if you have interest in whether it's just competition or peaking for an event, or even if you are doing, say, ketogenic approach. Would that same book be good for people that are doing the carnivore approach? Would that fit into it okay, or would they have to kind of align more to a keto approach?
No, 100%. I mean, you could totally take that book, take everything that it says and just put carnivore there instead of keto, and the same rules 100% apply.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see with competitors making or undertaking a contest prep?
Well, if they're trying to do it from a ketogenic standpoint, it's easy for them to, like I see a lot of people just simply doing, like they'll consider keto to be low carb. Like that's just it in their mind. But they don't really put much attention towards the fat to protein ratios. And oftentimes they'll just keep protein at a constant high intake and then just keep dropping fat lower and lower and lower. But when you become keto adapted, fat adapted, and your energy is coming from that fat, if you keep protein at a constant high and you keep dropping fat and you're not consuming carbs, then you're not going to have energy to perform at a high level as you get deeper into that deficit, especially. And when you are training, when you're in a deficit, training hard and continuing to demand your muscles be used is the single best thing you can do to preserve lean tissue. But if you're not consuming any energy and your body is trying to inefficiently use gluconeogenesis from the protein you're consuming for energy, your training is going to suffer. You're not going to be able to maintain the lean tissue that you have. Your hormones are going to tank. Everything is just going to go wrong, and it's not going to be sustainable for you. So I see a lot of people just simply not consuming ample dietary fat when the goal is fat loss.
Yeah, that's a fantastic explanation. So how would you approach a peak week differently? Because I know that even people that take low carb approaches, traditionally that last week they'll go berserk with the carbs and add them back in, which could probably go haywire if they haven't experimented with having carbs for a very long time. So when you're approaching that peak week with a ketogenic diet, how would you go about that?
Yeah, so I'll typically have my ketogenic caloric refeed on Friday. Sometimes I'll have like a consecutive 2-day refeed, so Thursday and Friday. And then I'll start manipulating my electrolytes on Friday evening. And I'll typically just increase overall sodium intake by, for me, it winds up being about 2,000, 2,500 milligrams above baseline. So I'm giving my body a bolus of sodium as well. And that basically draws any of the subcutaneous fluid into the muscle tissue and outside of that layer of skin, so that I'm able to have a thinner skin on show day and bring out more muscle fullness and vascularity. But yeah, just kind of playing around with that distribution of fat to protein and the amount of sodium that I'm increasing by is the main thing. Certainly no carbohydrate refeed or anything of that nature. And I don't cut water either. That's another big difference. Like a lot of competitors, they'll cut water, they'll load water, they'll dehydrate, try and do like a dry fast or just take in minimal fluid. And that's going to cause them to look very flat because, I mean, the muscles need that fluid to fill out. You want your body to be as hydrated as possible. You don't want to have a lot of unnecessary fluid in your subcutaneous layer of skin, but you want as much fluid in your actual muscle tissue as possible. So not cutting water and staying hydrated and staying healthy is key for sure.
Yeah, I never understood the water deprivation leading up to a show because I've always just kept water the same. I've never done any last minute hocus pocus before getting on stage because I've always sort of thought that if you're lean and you're ready, then you're ready. Basically, you don't have to do too much. Like you said, fill out your food a little bit towards the end and get on stage and have, as long as you're feeling good, because a lot of these last minute manipulations can also make the person going on stage feel like absolute shit as well. And I think that, comes through when they're on stage.
Oh, totally, man. Like I've been on stage with competitors that had to literally walk off stage because they were cramping so bad because they were dehydrated. And it's like they put in so much work and they can't even showcase it at the end because they've screwed up something royally there at the end. So yeah, being healthy is key. And then being lean enough is key too. Like there's not going to be any miraculous things happening the last 5 days, 6 days of a show or going into peak week that's going to cause you to just miraculously change the way you look. So simply coming into stage conditioned is the key for sure.
For someone that's so passionate about bodybuilding, you've been in it for a long time and you've studied it and you've got an amazing and extensive knowledge base. Have you ever been tempted, to scratch the itch to go to the enhanced side for a while? Why have you stayed natural all this time?
Yeah, I feel like for me at this point, I've kind of wrapped up my identity in being natural. And honestly, I just prefer it. Like there's so much more the body is capable of than people give it credit for. And I really want to just pull the curtain back on what is possible. And, like I continue to get better every single year that passes. So if I'm continually getting better, why do I need to look for some external force to make me even quote unquote better when in reality, that may cause more of a detriment to my overall long-term health and well-being. And I feel like I've seen so many people go that route, man. And again, not to their discredit, like they're putting in work too. Like I'm not suggesting that I'm better than them by any means. I've just taken a different route. But for me, like I see so many people that go that route and they start to suffer from various physical ailments, but then also the mental component. Like they can't cycle off of it because they like the way they look and feel so much when they're on it. But if they never cycle off of it, then they're going to have, issues from an endogenous production of their own hormones. Like it just becomes a slippery slope. That's just a slope I don't want to go down.
Yeah, that's great. Obviously, that it speaks, to your mindset as well. Have you always had a strong mindset, or have you developed particular mindset tools over the years? Because you can't deny that bodybuilding is a large part, very much the psychology behind it, as you mentioned in your book.
Well, I think my mindset certainly improved as a result of the bodybuilding. I definitely didn't have the psychological acumen that I do now. And I still hope to continue to improve that with every day that passes. But I think bodybuilding is a great vehicle to present a self-imposed hardship that gives me reason to improve my mindset, gives me a roadmap to do so. That and, business and entrepreneurship and, having a son now, having a relationship, like having all these different factors in my life that give me reason to want to improve my mind state is all key. But yeah, bodybuilding certainly has paved the way for me to build upon that for sure.
Yeah, like I was saying before, you're a fantastic role model, and I think an example of what can be achieved with the ketogenic diet or even a carnivore diet for those that are maybe you've brushed it off and dismissed it out of hand. Where can people find you? Because one of the things that I love about your social media presence is your podcast. You've done over almost close to 700 episodes, and if people just flick through the index of what's contained in those episodes, you go all over the territory in terms of the information that's available, related to ketogenic dieting, but from everything from psychedelics to all sorts of topics, and it's just so far-reaching and ranging as well.
I appreciate
What else? Yeah, what else can people find you on, and if they want to contact you for coaching or speak to you consultation-wise?
Yeah, so I'm pretty much all things Keto Savage. So Keto Savage, you type that in, you'll find me. Keto Brick is the name of our food product company. I'm not sure when this podcast is going live, but I am on the verge of publishing a course that is going to totally change the game for ketogenic bodybuilding. It's going to be ketobodybuilding.com is the website for that one. But it's going to be a course. It's going to have a community. It's going to have like a specialized ketogenic AI that is pretty much, all the stuff that I've said and recommended over the years. It's just going to be totally change the landscape in the realm of ketogenic bodybuilding, but that'll be ketobodybuilding.com.
I'd love to sign up for that myself because, I'm always wanting to learn more as well. And I learned a tremendous amount from your book. And I encourage everybody to go out and get the book Ketogenic Bodybuilding by Robert Sikes. But I'm definitely keen to sign up for that course, and I will do a review for it on the site as a video. And maybe you can come on again sometimes, or we can discuss that a little bit more and promote that to the audience, because the signal to noise ratio in this game these days is huge, and the people with the best voices often don't get heard because they're not flashy or causing some kind of drama. And you're definitely one of those voices. My friend Craig Winter, I'm not sure if he's an Aussie competitive bodybuilder. He comes on the show sometimes. He wanted to come on this show and speak with you, but the times didn't align with him. So if we could maybe have another chat when that's released and we can review it and talk more about it, that would be fantastic, Robert.
Yeah, I'd love to chat again. Love to meet him. Love to get y'all's thoughts on the course. I'm certainly proud of it, and I think it'll be a great resource for people for sure.
Great. Well, I'll put all your contact details in, contact socials in the details, and people can reach out to you from there. But I just really want to thank you once again for allowing me your time and for coming on and answering some questions.
Thank you, Sean. I really appreciate it, man. Take care.
Yeah, best of luck. Thank you very much.